Hello to those of you coming in. We're gonna start and introduce ourselves in the next few minutes. We're just gonna wait until a few more people trickle in. So we're gonna give folks, I think, like 2 to 3 more minutes, and then we'll get started. Okay. And while we're waiting, I think we're gonna launch a poll just to see where folks are tuning in from. So if you're willing, it'd be great if you could answer that. And then once we get that started, I'll go over like just a few more expectations for the presentation, and yeah, a little bit more information. So you think we can launch the attendee roles poll? Great. So while we're waiting for more people to come in, if you could um, fill this out, that would be really great. Just so we know who's in the audience today and who we're going to be engaging with. Okay, so 3 boroughs represented. That's good. Okay. Okay, so um, thank you for those of you who participated. Um, I think it's safe to get started now. So um, yeah, we can just jump into it. So my name's Ross Baker. I'm a school uh, discipline and special education advocate here at Advocates for Children.
And I am Naftali Moore. I am a staff attorney on the School and Justice Project here at Advocates for Children. It's nice to see you all.
So just a few notes before we jump into things. This project is going to be, or this presentation, sorry, is recorded. So it will be up on our website afterwards. So if you want to share it or if you feel like you missed something, you can check it out on our YouTube. Additionally, the slides will be sent to participants after the presentation. So if there are hyperlinks or things in the presentation that you want to look more at, or we go too fast, then you can take a look at those after the presentation. Additionally, there is a Q&A function. So if you have any questions, please utilize that function. We'll either try to answer the questions live, or one of us will type the answer in the little answer box in the Q&A function. And then lastly, we'll stop the recording once we're done presenting the content, and we'll hang around for a few minutes if you have specific questions, but don't feel comfortable asking them in a recorded session. So with that, I guess we'll just jump into things. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about navigating school discipline in New York City. For those of you who might have just come in, I'm Ross Baker, and I'm joined by my colleague Naftali Moore, and we're both on the School Justice Project at Advocates for Children. Okay, so today's training, we're going to do an introduction to school discipline and an introduction to ourselves and ASC. We're then going to talk about the types of suspensions and parents' rights for each type of suspension, legal protections for students with disabilities, and key takeaways. And we have a few slides built in for questions, but I encourage folks to ask questions as they come up. So like I said, we'll be monitoring the chat. So don't feel like you have to wait. So what is Advocates for Children? Okay. I see someone raise their hand. If you have a question, could you please just use the Q&A function? Um, you should be able to just type a question there. So AFC, we're an independent organization that protects the rights of all New York City students. We offer guided resources like this one, along with other workshops and trainings. We have a helpline that's operational from Monday through Thursday between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. And our helpline specialists are there to answer questions or escalate families to an advocate if they need more targeted intervention. And then also we provide free legal services to low-income families. All of our work in advocacy is centered around education in New York City. So in our suspension and discipline work, our goal is to help young people who are facing juvenile and/or criminal justice system involvement, school suspension, exclusion from school due to their behavior, bullying behavior, and we strongly believe in advocating for alternatives to discipline and for behavior supports and services so students remain in schools. And then also we participate in city and statewide coalitions to reform school discipline policies and procedures and advocate for investments in supports for students. So while both of us actually do individual kind of casework, we also do a lot of coalition and team building to try to push for changes and more supports in New York City DOE schools. Okay, so just a few things about suspension. So students who are suspended are more likely to miss class, be held back a grade, be suspended again, drop out, or get arrested. So it's not saying that, a suspension is like a guaranteed predictor of any of these things. But we've just seen data that suggests that the likelihoods of these things happening trend a little bit higher when students are missing significant amounts of school due to suspensions. So some data we have here, in the 2021 to 2022 school year, the DOE issued over 25,000 suspensions and over 6,600 classroom removals. 40% of all suspensions went to students with disabilities, but students with disabilities only comprise about 21% of DOE enrollment. Black students received over half of all superintendent suspensions, despite making up just over 21% of DOE enrollment. So what this data suggests is that students with disabilities and then Black students are bearing the brunt of disproportionate suspensions in the DOE, which are trends that are on par with what we've seen in the past. But it's really unfortunate that these trends continue. And this is kind of like the nexus of a lot of our advocacy is trying to reduce suspensions, but then also reduce disproportionalities as well. And one thing I can mention is I know this data is from 2021 to 2022, but in the past 2022 to 2023 school year, we've seen a 27% rise in suspensions, which would have been a 6% rise in the last year before schools went to a hybrid model due to COVID. So we have seen suspensions pretty steadily increasing. Okay, so here we're gonna launch a little poll, and I'm gonna ask folks to tell me if these things are true or false. So I'll give you a second to sit with both the poll and then also the slide. It should have the same information. Okay, so, all right, so I'm seeing a good mix of answers. So I'm gonna end the poll, and share the results with everyone. So the first thing is the school can call you to come pick up your child early. So this is actually false. The school cannot call you to tell you to come pick up your child early. We're going to talk a little bit more about types of suspensions, but there are procedures that schools have to follow if they're going to call you or tell you that you have to pick up your child early. So you shouldn't be in a situation where out of the blue you receive a call and are told you have to pick up your child. There are procedures that the school is required to follow for DOE regulations. Um, your child needs a doctor's approval to come back. So this one is also false. Unless your child is injured and you're worried about their safety, your child does not need a doctor's approval to come back to school. This shouldn't really be part of the suspension process. After suspension, you have to meet with the principal before your child can come back to school. This also is false. So sometimes if you want, you can meet with the principal. There are also conferences that happen after a principal suspension, but it is not a requirement for school reentry. And then the principal can call EMS if they think your child is a danger to themselves and others. So this one is kind of a trick question. There's not really a true or false answer. Unfortunately, we see schools and principals do this quite a lot. But there is kind of like a threshold where a student has to pose a significant threat to themselves and others. And it should be a pretty high threshold, like the schools should be trained in de-escalation techniques. So, well, it is something that the principals have the right to do. It's something that we always advocate that doesn't happen immediately. Unfortunately, with a lot of schools in the city, this is like an earlier step than a lot of other things. But it should kind of be like a last resort if there's really like if there's a lot of danger. To these questions in the chat real quick, I'm gonna go over the discipline code a little bit later. And we can also send a link out with that after, and it can be found in the presentation, which will have specific information on all of these things. And then also, if you want more things in writing too, we can send guides out later. And then the last thing is a student can be suspended for a year. So this actually is true, but we'll talk a little bit more about what this means, because I do think, in a sense, there's certain requirements that have to be met for this to be the case. So it's not like, any student can just be suspended for a year on the whim of a single administrator or something like that. So thank you all for participating. And thanks for putting questions in the chat. Again, we'll both try to continue to monitor the chat as we go on. So here we're going to talk a little bit about types of suspensions and removals in New York City. So like I referred to just a few minutes ago, this is the New York City Discipline Code. So this is kind of a guide and a handbook around behavioral expectations and discipline in the district. So it's as much of a document to hold schools accountable as it is a document to hold students accountable, and that there are expectations for the behavior of students, but then also expectations for the supports that schools are supposed to offer students. So although it's called a discipline code, it's not just like a long penal document where it talks about things that students can't do. And the punishments, it does include some of those things towards the end, but it also has a lot of language about what the schools are required to do as far as providing behavioral supports, targeted intervention for students. So like I mentioned before, this is kind of the section where they talk about infractions of a discipline code. So these are some of the categories. And we only put this here just to familiarize folks with the language, because this is the language that you would see on like in a suspension packet or at a suspension hearing. But then these are some of the responses to those infractions. So on the left side, there's plenty of responses that we would consider a little bit more progressive discipline, where you're actually offering supports to students and ramping up those supports as needed. But then on the right, you also see the corresponding punishment or school removals for a given infraction. Okay. So I think I'm going to turn it over here.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the types of suspensions. There's actually 3 types of suspensions, and these are suspensions that are permitted under the discipline code. So any other type of suspensions, I know that was mentioned, like picking up a child from school, it's really kind of illegal and it's called an informal suspension. It's not really under the discipline code. So these are the ones that are actually okay. So the first one is the teacher's removal. It is up to 4 days, and it's only a removal from the teacher's class. The parent has the right to ask for a meeting, and if a parent does ask for a meeting, then the meeting must be held within 2 days. What is entitled is a phone call. A parent must be called every time that the student is removed from the teacher's classroom. The next type of suspension is called a principal suspension. These are done at the principal's discretion. It's up to 5 days. It is considered really a shorter term suspension, and the principal must hold a conference before they determine if they're going to suspend the student. There is an exception, and that exception is if the principal argues that there's a potential safety risk or threat of ongoing danger. And for this one, the parent is entitled to written notice about this suspension before it takes place. The next type of suspension is a longer term suspension. It's called the superintendent suspension. It's usually between 6 to 20 days. If it is over 20 days, that means it's a level 5 infraction. And I'll get more into that briefly. But this is the type of suspension where a suspension hearing must be held. And that will be discussed more in depth later in the presentation, what a suspension hearing looks like and what it involves. This does require a formal hearing at the borough suspension hearing office, and the parent is entitled to a written notice for this. So the suspensions that last longer than 20 days, they're only allowed for certain level 5 infractions that are listed in the infraction discipline codes. So the other type of removals that usually schools do that are not really allowed, for example, or is when the school calls a parent and states that a parent needs to come and pick up their child. Again, that is illegal, and that's an informal type of removal. Or if a school is forcing a parent to transfer their student out of that school. So the next slide really talks about other discipline matters that the schools usually try to take that really are illegal, and again, informal or formal. So the one that we usually can see is one where a student that's under 17 years old that does have an IEP is being expelled. Or we see one where corporal punishment is being used, which is not allowed, right? Or we see where either a student is being transferred without permission or a parent is being forced to transfer their child out of the school. With those are very serious discipline matters that the school decides to take, and that can actually be reported to something called the Office of Special Investigations. Like I said, the last slide that we went through, those are the 3 major suspensions: teacher, superintendent and principal. So anything that does not look like that is again illegal, informal, or formal. And it definitely, you have a right to actually do a claim or try to even see if the school can be held accountable for that.
Okay, thank you, Naftali. So we're going to go a little bit more in depth on the types of suspension that Naftali just talked about. So for a principal suspension, a written notice is required. So it must be done by personal delivery within 24 hours. This is a little bit tricky because this is kind of based on established connection between the parent and the school. So in some cases, that might be email. However, in other cases, it might be a parent comes for pickup or sending a notice home with a student. Um, Again, it's kind of between the parent and the school, but there must be a notice within 24 hours. Families should receive statement of students' rights, the reasons for suspension, including the date, time, and the place of the incident, the period of removal, and the location of alternate instruction. So sometimes for principal suspension, this will be like the alternate instruction will be in the main office. And then the date, time, and place of the suspension conference, which is a conference that includes the principal and the family. So students are allowed to stay in class until the suspension conference, except if there is what's called a threat of danger. So again, this is something that's a little bit tough to enforce for us against schools, just because there's a little bit of a gray area, and schools could try to claim that there is an imminent threat of danger if there was like an argument or something. But this is really supposed to be reserved when there is a serious threat of harm posed to the student or the school community by the student being in their classes. So at the conference, the principal must attend and decide if suspension is justified. Parents have the right to present the student's version and question witnesses. They have the right to interpret it, as is the case with almost all DOE communication between parents and the schools. Parents have a right to communicate in their primary language, and also a right to receive documentation in their primary language. And then also parents are within their rights to create a plan to address behavior going forward with the school. So a superintendent suspension is the most kind of severe form of discipline that the DOE has. So the notice is a little bit more formal. So for a superintendent suspension, the school must get approval from the superintendent and call the parent immediately. Parent must get written notice within 24 hours, including the reason for suspension, the alternate learning center or alternative school location. For superintendent suspensions, this is usually not in the same school building that the student is normally attending class in. Details about the hearing within 5 school days, a witness list of people, students, faculty, anyone who was involved in the incident, and then parents' rights in places to call for help or representation. So we actually support families with suspension cases, and our name is on the list. So our name should be in the packet if parents get a superintendent suspension notice and need representation. So this is just a sample notice of superintendent suspension. So to Paula parent, it has the information about their child, Sam student, the day of the suspension, and then the alternate learning site that the student is supposed to attend while they are serving their suspension. And then here at the bottom, you'll see the suspension hearing date, and it will tell you where the suspension hearing is taking place. And I think, like Naftali mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, each borough has their own suspension office. So usually the hearing office will correspond with the borough that the school is in. This is just a continuation of the document. So as you can see at the top, there's a short charge written, which is engaged in physically aggressive behavior as he swung his fist at Tina teacher. There's a standard notice. This behavior constitutes a danger to the health, safety, welfare, and morals of your child and others at the school. I only mention that that's standard because in the past I've talked with parents who did not like that they received this, which I mean, I also kind of think it's not really a necessary thing to include in the document, but it is just something that's standard. So it's not like based on an individual circumstance, should you come across it. And then there's also the witness list. So this, in this case, the witness would be Tina teacher. She would be the only witness related to this incident. Okay, so then there's also the suspension packet, which is a different document than the suspension notice. So the suspension packet should have the occurrence report, which is a report the school creates that goes into their system where the database where they log any behavior related incidents. Witness statements, including from the student. So these are written statements taken after an incident occurs where students, faculty, or anyone involved can write what happened. A records cover sheet. So this will be a sheet that says what's included in the packet. So this could have information related to grades, attendance, any past behavioral concerns, an evidence voucher, injury reports, video, and any other school records. The school must give it to families before the hearing. Again, this is another kind of gray area that can be a little tricky in doing suspension representation, just because you know, a school might prepare the packet and provide it to a family the morning of the hearing and say it was technically before the hearing. But we always strongly advocate for parents to obtain the suspension packet as quickly as possible, just because it lets them have more of an idea of how they want to proceed. So again, this is just a document that is a sample records cover sheet. So you can see all the information up top relating to the student, the grade the student's in, whether or not the student has an IEP, brief academic record and attendance history, and then suspension history with the corresponding infraction code written next to them. This is the second piece of the cover sheet. So the cover sheet comes in like a legal paper, so it's a little bit longer than a standard document. There's a section at the top that discusses a student's disciplinary record or past disciplinary behaviors. And then there's a section that has prior guidance, interventions, and recommendations. Like I mentioned before, the DOE embraces what they refer to as progressive discipline. So before resulting to school removals and suspensions, the DOE and schools are supposed to provide support and more targeted interventions to students. So this is an opportunity for the school to write what types of interventions they provided prior to asking for a superintendent suspension. So this part is important to have, and also I would really recommend like following up with the school about this and asking them specifically about what prior interventions took place. And then at the bottom, there is a section that indicates how many days the school is asking for. I think this is actually a little bit of an older form. So there's usually more days, but be 6 to 10, 15 to 20, or more than 20. So this is an example of a witness statement. Where a student or someone in the school community writes their account of what happened. In this instance, it's written by an educational assistant, and it just describes what happened, but this is what a witness report looks like. This is the ORS report that I was discussing before. So this is the school's write-up of the occurrence or behavior that happened that they enter into the monitoring system. Okay, so you have three options when there's a superintendent suspension hearing. You can adjourn for good cause. So this could be, often families will adjourn because they'll only find out at the hearing that they're entitled to representation. And they might say, okay, we want representation. Or they'll adjourn because the date doesn't work for them. But it is important to know that when families adjourn, the suspension continues. So unless the school adjourns, the student is required to stay and keep serving their suspension until the hearing. Families can plead no contest. This is basically saying that the family and student are not admitting nor denying the charge, but they're just accepting the charge as written and willing to accept the willing to let the hearing office interpret the disciplinary reaction. Sometimes this is a good option for families if the evidence is a lot worse than the charge necessarily. And typically when families plead no contest, they'll, depending on the past history of a student, they'll receive a little bit less time than what the school is requesting. But I would say this is really only an option if the evidence or if something else is really severe, like there's an injury report which details injury to another student or faculty member, but isn't necessarily included in the charge written on the notice. And then the third option is to proceed with the hearing. And we can talk a little bit more about that. And yes, superintendent suspensions can be over 20 days. Again, the level 5 infraction that Naftali referred to before is for kind of like the most serious violations of infractions. And students really are not supposed to be out of school or suspended for more than 20 days. So I would say it's really important that families know their rights, and families also try to get an advocate in cases where the school wants students out for a prolonged period of time. Okay. So hearing officer, so the decision for a superintendent suspension, the hearing officer makes recommendations based on testimony and all documents and evidence. So within 2 days of the hearing, the parent must receive notification whether the charge is sustained or dismissed, where the student is supposed to attend school or their alternate learning center, how the suspension will be reflected in students' records, and when the suspension will be expunged from the students' records. And then within 5 days, the hearing office must mail a full report of findings and dispositions to the parents. Families and advocates are also within their right to request a transcript of the hearing from the suspension hearing office. Students remain at alternative education sites pending decision, unless parties agree otherwise. So for most infractions, the superintendent may immediately reinstate the student to school, continue the suspension for up to 20 days. For very serious behavior, only by main office approval, so the Office of Safety and Youth Development with the DOE. The superintendent may continue the suspension for more than 20 school days up to 1 year. And there's supposed to be a review for 40 or more school days. And then also, again, this has to be approved by OSID, the Office of Safety and Youth Development. Expulsion is only possible for students without IDEA protections who turn 17 before the school year. So if a student has an IEP or is under the age of 17, a student cannot be expelled from the DOE. And then also, superintendent should offer recommended services, and then grant or deny a school transfer if parent requests it. But again, as Naftali mentioned before, schools cannot force families or students to transfer. They're not within their right to do that, and that's not an appropriate form of discipline in the DOE. So to appeal a suspension decision, an appeal must be in writing and state the grounds for appeal and the relief requested. So the first level is to the chancellor, or the Office of Legal Services for the DOE. So this appeal must be filed within 20 school days of the date of decision, or within 10 school days from receiving the recording or tape of the hearing transcript. And then the next level of appeal is to the New York State Ed Commissioner, and this must be initiated within 30 days of decision unless the delay is excused by a commissioner for a good cause shown in the petition. Okay, so here we have like a little built-in break for questions. I know that folks have been asking questions throughout the presentation, so thank you for that. I guess I'll pause for a moment just to see if there are any more questions here that I can try to answer live. What does that provide educator behavior intervention? So we have a behavioral intervention webinar coming up actually on the 6th, I believe. I do want to clarify though that most of our organization's expertise is around DOE policies and procedures and also parents' rights. So we don't typically offer like pedagogical instruction as far as like within like teacher training or something like that. We in our behavior support webinar, we do have some information on like positive behavior interventions that we've seen used and that we think are really solid, and also like things that some of the providers that we work with tell us are successful tools. But we typically mainly stick to what supports and resources are available within the DOE. So I hope that answers the question. I mean, I know it's not a direct answer, unfortunately, to talking about like direct behavior interventions, but I think our behavior intervention training might speak a little bit more to that, but also we don't typically do like teacher trainings or professional development in that capacity. Okay, so I'm gonna continue on. Again, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. This was just an opportunity to break, but please keep asking questions. And again, like I said at the beginning, we will be, after we end the recording, we'll hang around for a little bit if folks have more specific questions. So for alternative instruction, students should be receiving homework, classwork, exams, full-time instruction, whether that be at the student's home school, a different school, or an alternative learning center. Students are supposed to be getting full instruction while they're suspended. So a suspension is not supposed to be a pause in any education. Students are supposed to be receiving and completing the work that they would be completing and receiving otherwise. So for principal suspensions or superintendent suspensions in K-8, students are entitled to full-time instruction. For high school, there's physical instruction for at least 2 hours a day. But again, students should be getting all the coursework they would regularly be getting. So it's really important to communicate with the school and with teachers when students are suspended, so they are keeping up with their coursework. And all students who continue to be suspended have a right to full-time instruction. So now we're going to transition a little bit and talk about protections for students with disabilities. So some key things here are expedited evaluations, a manifestation determination review, also called an MDR, a suspension plan, and a functional behavioral assessment and behavioral intervention plan. So who is a student with a disability for discipline purposes? So students with IEPs, students with 504 plans, or students where the school is deemed to know if a student has a disability. So if there have been, for example, many of the same behavioral infractions, and a student hasn't been evaluated yet, but an instructor thinks that, or has good cause to think that a student might have a disability, then that would mean that the school is deemed to know. So the right to expedited evaluations, suspended students must get expedited evaluations when parent requests an initial evaluation, or school is deemed to know, like I mentioned before. And these evaluations must be done within 15 days of parental consent. So the MDR is a meeting to decide if the student's behavior was caused by the student's disability or a result of the school's failure to follow the student's IEP or BIP. So the BIP that I mentioned before is the Behavioral Intervention Plan. So this meeting is a question of whether the behavior was a manifestation of the disability or of the school's, I guess, lack or not lack of implementing the plan that they previously created related to this behavior and related to the disability. So if it is a manifestation, the student returns to school. The school must do a functional behavioral assessment and then a BIP. If not, then the suspension continues, but schools must create a suspension plan. So a plan of how a student with an IEP is going to continue receiving services while suspended, and how they're going to receive behavioral supports going forward. So they can still consider doing an FBA and a BIP. When must the school hold an MDR? When the student is suspended for 11 or more days in a row within 40 school days, or there's a pattern. So sometimes students will get suspended for very short periods at a time, but it's important to kind of just pay attention to how long these suspensions are and how close they're happening together. I mean, parents always have the right to ask for an evaluation or try to ask for an intervention or an MDR, but these are when they are mandated and when they must happen. So during an MDR, the team must review the IEP, any FBA or BIP that already exists, evaluations and teacher observations, occurrence reports, records from the parent, or other information. So these last two categories are important because these could be records from outside providers, testimony from outside providers who can speak to the nature of a student's disability or of a student's IEP, who can relate behavior to a disability. And then here's a DOE worksheet, which the DOE actually uses in the case of MDRs. So it states who is there. You can see a representative of the school district knowledgeable about the student and the interpretation of information about the student's behavior. So sometimes this is a school psychologist, social worker, or special education teacher from the district or from the student's home school, the parent, any other providers, and all the people involved must be documented. And also there's a guide to continue on that kind of like guides the meeting forward so that the school and the family and the Committee on Special Education can collectively decide if a given behavior was a manifestation of a certain disability. So in preparing for the MDR, it's really important to review all the documents. So especially if there already is a BIP, like I mentioned before, this is really important because a behavior, for example, might not be a manifestation of a student's disability itself, but it could be a manifestation of the school's inability to implement the BIP or the BIP. So for example, if there's something in the BIP that says a student must take a certain amount of breaks at a certain time and the school doesn't implement that, that's really important to know, because then as a parent or an advocate, you can point out in the meeting, well, look, this is what the school said they would do, and this is what the specialists agreed that the school would do, and they didn't do it. So this is something that would lead folks to draw the conclusion that it's a manifestation of a certain disability or of a behavior. So yeah, make sure students are getting all services on their IEP. Ask outside providers to participate in whatever capacity they can. Fortunately, it can be really hard to track down providers and get them directly involved. But even testimony or past written evaluations is really helpful, just because it always helps to have people who are knowledgeable about the individual student and what their needs are. Okay. I'm gonna pause here again for any more questions. I know it's not the quickest since folks have to write questions, but I'll pause here for a minute or so. Okay. I'll continue on, but again, if there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll try to answer them as we go. So 5 key takeaways from our presentation today. Schools should try to help students with positive interventions before suspending them. Notices with the exclusion of teachers removals must be in writing. So a principal suspension or a superintendent suspension must be in writing and must be documented. Parents are within their right to ask for principal suspension conferences for any principal suspensions or what are commonly thought of as in-school suspensions. Always get the packet in a superintendent suspension and always try to get it as quickly as possible, just because this can help families prepare for the suspension meeting and how they want to proceed with the meeting. And then no out-of-school suspensions. So students are entitled to be getting their education and their educational needs met during any suspension. So this is another way of saying that students are required to have an alternative learning center or some sort of alternative placement while they're being suspended, because they aren't supposed to miss any learning as a result of any type of discipline. So while they technically might be out of their regular school building, they should still be in some sort of an educational environment while they're serving their suspension. So again, I know we covered a lot today, but here we have ways to reach us for more specific questions in the future, or if you feel like you might have a specific circumstance that you want more information on. I think we're going to launch one last survey just about the presentation. So if you could fill that out, that would be really helpful. Like I said before, we're going to send the presentation itself out. So folks have a question to, folks have an opportunity to actually go through the slides and kind of click on any of the links or any of the documents we might have discussed. We also have our info email up here. So if you have questions or want any more information, please reach out to that email. We also have a bunch of resources, like written resources on our website. So we have a school discipline guide, a suspension guide that has a lot of the same information, just written. So it might be a little bit easier to follow, just because you won't have to deal with like me rambling or getting lost. And yeah, this will be recorded and on YouTube. We have other webinars on YouTube as well. So if you feel like there might have been something that I went through too fast, you can go back and revisit that. Okay, so I see a few questions here. I'm gonna try to answer them. Students not receiving the services outlined in their IEP, then the behavior is considered a manifestation. Yeah. So yeah, that's a great question. So if a student is not receiving the services outlined in their IEP, then the behavior is considered a manifestation of their disability. So yes, if the school and the DOE are doing their best to provide the services as stated on the IEP, and they're not providing them like in the school or in the setting, then it is safe to say that it is a manifestation of their disability. So if there are specific interventions listed or a class placement and a student is not receiving that placement, and then they're getting in trouble for a behavior, then they should not be, that behavior should be considered a manifestation of their disability, and they should be returned to school, and there should be a functional behavioral assessment and then a behavioral intervention plan to follow. So I hope that answers the question. Do schools pick more than one listed in the range of disciplinary responses? For different infractions, yes, but for one infraction, it should be pretty standard. I mean, that's kind of the point of a suspension hearing, is that there should be a standard across schools. Unfortunately, there's not. So, like, for example, some schools are really have really strong community and might never resort to any sorts of suspensions because they handle everything internally. But the superintendent suspension and the hearing is a vehicle for there to be a more equitable application of the discipline code across the DOE. That a student must receive education when suspended. That should be in the chancellor's regulations in addition to the discipline code. If you want, you can reach out to us after the presentation and we can help you find it, but it should be in the chancellor's regulations. Okay. And for one infraction, that is not a suspension. Sorry, I might have missed that because it's part of another question. We'll if you want to rephrase that, that might be helpful. Sorry about that. We will stick around for 2 more minutes with the recording, and then we'll end the recording. And if folks have more questions, then we'll try to answer them. So let's pick more than one item listed in the range that did not result. Yeah, so I mean, a disciplinary response that's not a suspension should be more of like an intervention. So that should be something like um something like counseling, mediation, other forms of like behavioral support. I think the range of disciplinary responses should, like, the only range really would be suspension or teacher's removal. Anything else that's like disciplinary, that's not really okay. Principal's office and exclusion from lunchtime. No, I mean, if it's a charter school, it's harder to enforce. But no. So like, if it's not an informal suspension or an exclusion, then no, there shouldn't, or yes, then there shouldn't be exclusion from lunchtime or like extended stays in the principal's office. And that's something that, again, if you're having trouble with, I would recommend you reach out to our helpline and we can try to support you in the discipline code. Again, we can we can help you find specific language and also help with advocacy if you need that in the future. And I guess while we're still recording, I realize I should mention that superintendent suspensions and any protections related to disabilities should be the same for charter schools. However, removals or exclusions like detentions, other things like that kind of vary by case, and it's really hard for the DOE to enforce any types of disciplinary measures or enforce any types of accountability about discipline in the discipline code on charter schools. So that's just something to note. So we're gonna now, think end the recording. Think we will stay on for a little bit longer if folks have more questions. So thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate you all being so engaged. It makes the presentation a lot easier and a lot more fun for us.